Hey everyone, welcome to another modern deck tech. Today I'm deck teching Lurrus Counter-Shadow. So a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a bit more than that, I deck tech Lurrus Counter-Cat, which is a slightly new take on an old deck, Counter-Cat, a deck that I love very much, very close to Teamer Delver, but running 4 colors, so instead of blue, red, green, you're running blue, red, green, and white. And there have been many iterations throughout the years, and I decided to spin it a bit more, and instead of going into white, going into black. Still playing Lurrus of the Dream Den as the companion. So let's take a look at Lurrus real quick. So we all know what Lurrus does. Great card. I mean, it's still slightly broken in my opinion, but a really good card and works really well in a deck like this. A really great way to bring back a lot of your creatures that are probably gonna, bite the dust in terms of removal in the early game. So Lurrus brings, gives you the ability to come back in the mid to late game, and in and of itself can attack in and get you some life gain. So I really like Lurrus as a companion, but here I've cut white and instead put in black. And let's take a look at the core, because the core changes in one creature. So in Lurrus Counter-Cat, which is the deck I deck tech previously, we played While in the Coddle. And While in the Coddle becomes a 3/3 if you have a mountain and a plains on the battlefield. So, it gets +1/+1 for each showing up. Now, it doesn't really work here because I don't want to play a plains in this deck when I'm not actually playing white. And I wanted to stay away from this deck becoming a 5-color deck. I am going to have a 5-color deck version of this coming, soon enough, so stay tuned for that, but this is already pretty greedy at 4 colors. So While in the Coddle really became unplayable, because it would, at best be a 2/2. So I said, okay, well, what can we do instead, and put in place of While in the Coddle? What's the next best drop in black? Well, come on, I mean, we all know what the answer is, Death's Shadow. And what's great about a deck like this is that, this deck always, Counter-Cat, I should say, always played it close to the chest in terms of your life. It's 4 colors. A lot of your lands are shocks and fetches, so you were already beating yourself down quite a bit in the first few turns. Death's Shadow kind of gains from that. It benefits from that, which makes it a pretty cool card. Now it's not going to be a card that you can slam turn 1 or turn 2, unlike While in the Coddle. So that is something we need to take into account. I think the deck suffers a bit in that regard, at least in terms of early game threats. But in late game or mid to late game, Death's Shadow becomes a problem for your opponents. And late game, they've already probably wasted some of their removal on your Delver of Secrets, your Goyf, your Dreadhorde Arcanist, so they may not have enough firepower to take care of Death's Shadow, which is always great. Now, I know you're asking the question, why would you play Lurrus in a deck that also has Death's Shadow? Because Lifelink kind of works against what Death's Shadow is trying to do, which is get your life total a bit lower so it can get bigger. Now, here's the thing. You don't, first of all, have to attack in with Lurrus when you eventually cast it. And you're not always casting Lurrus. Lurrus is really there when you're kind of in a bind or you really have nothing else to do with your mana, which is rare in a deck like this. So Lurrus is coming down mid to late game anyway, and it's completely up to you if you want to attack or block with it. And that being said, sometimes you actually need a life link or life gain type effect to kind of bring you back from a match like against the Burn, for example, or a really aggro-based deck where Death's Shadow, maybe Death's Shadow is not the best strategy for you at this point in time, so some lifelink might help. But let's not get away from the main reason why you're playing Lurrus here. The main reason you're playing Lurrus is to be able to get your other, ideally better creatures out of the graveyard and back onto the battlefield. In this case, it would be Tarmogoyf would be your prime target, then would be Dreadhorde Arcanist or Delver of Secrets, or even Death's Shadow. It really depends where you are. I don't think there's a wrong target here, but that's the main reason why I'm even playing Lurrus in this deck, or else the deck would work without it. I would, just have an extra slot on my sideboard. So I just wanted to make that point because I think, a lot of you would probably pick that up right away. Death's Shadow and Lurrus kind of have a non-bow effect there, but again, Lurrus is really just there as a utility. It's a way for you to get back creatures, and if it survives more than one turn, great, because you can bring back more than one creature. In my experience, it dies after you bring back the first, but that's just a point I wanted to make off the bat before we get deeper into this deck. Everything else stays pretty much the same. Of course, you're playing Delver of Secrets, and you're playing Tarmogoyf, and the other creatures, I kept Dreadhorde Arcanist. Now, if you look at my Lurrus Counter-Cat deck, a very similar structure, and that's really on purpose. I actually looked at the deck, I'm like, what's white? Get rid of it, replace it with black, and, you know, pick ideal black spells and go from there. So there's going to be some things I'm going to note as we go forward here, and some things that you might want to tweak if you decide to take this deck, you know, to an FNM, or you just want to, you know, test it out yourself. So let's get to the cantrips. The cantrips don't change in this instance. We're still playing 4 serums, 3 sleight, 3 ops, so nothing really changed here. There's no reason to change it. This works really well. You know, you're not really cantripping anything in black. Now, in the removal slots, we have 4 Lightning Bolt, and instead of Lightning Helix, we now have Fatal Push, 4 of, and Assassin's Trophy. So what black brings with us, or what the black package brings to this deck, is, you know, some slightly better removal. You know, removal in the sense of Fatal Push, not, you know, ramping up your opponents, unlike Path to Exile. But you also have Assassin's Trophy, which does ramp your opponents. But what's nice about Assassin's Trophy is that you could target anything. Destroy target permanent an opponent controls. So you could target lands, enchantments, artifacts, doesn't really matter. You can even target planeswalkers. So that's what's great about Assassin's Trophy. So I don't really care that it's ramping up my opponent by 1, because I'm probably not targeting like an Arbor Elf or Birds of Paradise with my Assassin's Trophy. I'm probably targeting something that's, you know, really of great value to my opponent that I want to get rid of. So this is what I really like. Of course, if you don't like Assassin's Trophy, you can replace it with Abrupt Decay or whatever else that you prefer. Now you have the Permission Package. The Permission Package doesn't change that much, but I'm not playing Spell Snare anymore. Instead, I'm playing Stubborn Denial. So Death Shadow and Tarmogoyf, both being 4 ofs, you know, satisfies my minimum requirement for playing Stubborn Denial in a deck. So Stubborn Denial is really only good when its Ferocious Trigger is active, because it becomes a 1 mana negate, which is super, super powerful, and your opponents rarely see it coming. Now, in Lurrus Counter-Cat, I was only playing Tarmogoyf, and my other creatures didn't really get past 3, you know, power. And that's really a problem here, because Ferocious Triggers at 4 or greater. Now, with Tarmogoyf and Death Shadow both in the mix, Stubborn Denial, I believe, is just the better choice as opposed to Spell Snare. Another thing I should mention, I probably would not play Counterspell in this deck once it becomes legal. I will test it out. It's just the mana requirements become icky, and going for 2 blue might cut me off other colors. I'm really not sure. This deck is already pretty painful in terms of its mana base, and I mean, Death Shadow does benefit from that, but still, that's something I need to keep in mind. So Mana Leak might still be the better option here as opposed to Counterspell. Just a note, because Counterspell is 2 blue, that is a big difference. Of course, if it does work, I'm definitely playing Counterspell over Mana Leak, you know, no question. But it's just something I need to test out before I say, yeah, go for it and swap it with Mana Leak. So before I get to the lands, although you're going to see the lands here, you're going to notice I'm not playing any discard spells. And I noticed that, when I was building this deck, which is, you know, mostly swapping from Lurrus Counter-Cat, I realized, man, there's really no space for discard. And I realized that's not really the game plan that I wanted to have. My game plan is very much the same as Lurrus Counter-Cat, which is, you know, tempo game, but, you know, keeping pressure on as early as possible. And although discard is very powerful, and you could probably make space for, you know, let's say 2 Inquisitions, or maybe even 3 Inquisitions in this deck, I didn't do it in my case. I decided to go the similar path as Lurrus Counter-Cat, just being as aggressive as possible and being removal heavy as possible, and that's what I had. If you want to play, let's say, even Thoughtseize, because you really want to, you know, pain yourself even more, or just playing, let's say, 2 to 3 Inquisitions Kozileks, I think you could make that room at the sacrifice of some removal. So it's really up to you what you prefer. Maybe it's more Metacall, but if you're playing against a lot of creature-based decks, a lot of aggro decks, you probably want to keep as much removal as possible as opposed to anything else. So that's just a quick note on hand disruption. The lands, essentially a carbon copy of Lurrus Counter-Cat, except I've swapped everything that produces white or fetches for white with things that produce black or fetch for black. Simple as that. As you can see, I'm playing one of, I think, every shock I can play. In a 4-color deck, I might be missing one. I have to double check that, but these are the shocks that I would play with. Obviously, this mana base is not cheap, but it is what it is. This deck is great and fun to play with, but the mana base is not cheap, and it's kind of hard to put in budget alternatives. So, you know, there's my little comment on budget here, but these are the lands that I would recommend you play with. I strongly suggest you don't play with any other type of land. You want lands that you can fetch for and you can play immediately. This deck really doesn't do well with slowdowns, so again, this is the fastest mana base I can think of that will get you what you want whenever you want. Sideboard. Again, sideboards are always subjective and very meta dependent, but let's start here. 3 Veil of Summer, of course, and I'm also playing 2 more Stubborn Denial. So if you're playing, if I'm playing against a control deck or if I'm playing against a combo deck, I'll remove a lot of my creature removal, and I'll add Stubborn Denial, more permission based spells. Natural State. I just took a quick survey of the meta, looking at most of the artifacts and enchantments I want to destroy or would be able to destroy. And Natural State made sense. I only like Natural State because I could also recast with Dreadhorde Arcanist. I think it's still a bit too cute if you want something that's a bit more, resilient and more, all reaching. I think that's the word I wanted to use. Then don't go Natural State. Use, Return to Nature or a Braid or whatever else you want to do. That 2+ mana. But Natural State allows me to, reuse it with Dreadhorde Arcanist, which is why I picked it. Cleansing Wildfire, I'm playing 3 of for disruption to lands. Obviously, you can't play Blood Moon in a deck like this unless you're nuts. And I wanted a card that would cantrip. Now, I could just play Alpine Moon in its place, which I think is actually a perfectly legitimate, card to play in place of Cleansing Wildfire. But I really just wanted something that allowed me to draw on top of destroying lands. So this Cleansing Wildfire is the one I went with. I guess you could go with Spreading Seas as well. Would have a similar effect, but Cleansing Wildfire makes more sense, and it allows you to flip your Delver, which is very important. Engineering Explosives, 2 of. You have access to 4 mana here, so 4 different colors of mana, I should say. So this could target permanents up to 4 CMC, which is wonderful. So definitely Engineering Explosives is a great card, but it could also be used against tokens, which is oftentimes why I'm bringing it in, or taking care of other 1/1 creatures, in decks that go wide quick and quicker than us in this deck. Last but not least, Surgical Extraction. For my graveyard hate, I'm definitely favoring less and less graveyard hate right now. I'm just assuming that when I play against Dredge, it's going to be a near impossible battle. And honestly, even with my graveyard hate cards, it often is still a very hard deck to beat, just because it's so degenerate, and I don't find it's worth, investing more sideboard space for, one deck that you don't even see that often. So if you are seeing it more often, then make more room for it in your sideboard. If you're not, don't plan for it, in the event of that you might see that one deck, that one Dredge deck every once in a while. All right, last but not least, the matchup. So let's get started with combo. Now, you have plenty of permission in the main, and you have more permission in the side. So I think for spell-based combo, again, a lot of my decks are generally fare pretty well against spell-based combo. Against non-spell-based combo, which in this case, in Modern right now, it's usually just Prime Time, and I suppose Heliod, you're going to suffer a bit more. Of course, if you're playing Prime Time decks, Cleansing Wildfire is going to help you out a lot. Your permission spells are also going to help you out a lot, let's say to stop Summoner's Pact or something else. But, it's really going to be a race, and really just making sure you slow them down as much as possible. Cavern of Souls is going to be a problem. So yeah, you're going to lean on Cleansing Wildfire quite a bit. But make room in your sideboard if you feel like you're going to be playing a lot of primetime decks. I don't think they're too out there, but if they are in what you're expecting to play, then, I think you could decide accordingly, and you could probably, grind it out. I didn't play enough of them with Lurrus Counter-Shadow. I did play with them with Lurrus Counter-Cat, and I did fare pretty well. I think it was more or less 50-50, which is, good enough, I think, for decks like this. So yeah, I think with a deck like this, you do also have Assassin's Trophy in the main, which can also target lands. So, you do have some play. You just have to have the right cards in hand at the right time. Aggro decks. So, again, this is going to be a bit of give and take. Aggro decks are definitely going to hurt you relatively quickly, and probably a bit more quicker than you will be hurting them. The thing is, if you do draw into or have 1 or 2 Death Shadows by the mid game, you're going to start casting those, and then all of a sudden those aggro decks have nowhere to go. So if you were able to mitigate some of the burn spells that usually come along with those aggro decks, using the the permission package that you already have in the main, and then you start to resolve really big Tarmogoyfs or just 3/3/4/4 Death Shadows, all of a sudden the aggro decks kind of stall, and then things turn in your favor. I mean, the scales turn in your favor, I should say. So that's really it with aggro decks. I would definitely not say they're your favorite in those matchups, but I don't think you're completely hopeless. Again, it's just making sure that you keep the right hand. Or, don't keep risky hands. Keep hands that are going to get you what you need in the early game. So keep that heavy removal hands. Those are really smart. And in the mid to late game, ideally you're going to be casting Lurrus. You can be bringing back some of your creatures, and you're going to be able to stabilize. And like I said, usually once you stabilize, that's when your aggro opponents are usually out of gas or nearly out of gas, and that's when you could start taking advantage of that and beating them out. Big mana decks. Again, you have permission, so hopefully you're drawn to your Force of Negations to be able to counter a lot of their Planeswalkers. You can use their Assassin's Trophy to take out their Tron lands, which is, when I'm talking about big mana decks, those are usually the types of decks I'm talking about. You do have, some good removal with black and Fatal Push, and you could also bring in other cards from the sideboard like Cleansing Wildfire to get rid of, again, mostly targeting the lands, but you also have Stubborn Denial as well on the side. If you choose to play more Stubborn Denials on the side, again, to deal with big mana. So I don't think you're completely helpless. I think you actually have quite a bit of game against them. Again, it's just a matter of making sure you keep strong hands and anticipating what they're about to do. If you know they're about to cast Karn next turn or Ugin, and you have permission for that, obviously don't commit to the board. Wait, and ideally counter it or deal with it some other way before you commit to the board. Just play intelligently, and I think you could deal with big mana relatively well. Dredge, like I said, I'm not really, planning for it as much anymore. You have Surgical Extraction. You do have permission, which can help slow Dredge down in the early game. You could really target their lands if you want to. Cleansing Wildfire, that might work. I don't know if it's the best strategy. It's just really going to be more of like cross your fingers and pray. That's basically the match against Dredge. Control. So Control is not going to be an easy match for you. And obviously when I'm talking about Control, almost all the Control decks now are, Stoneblade decks. There's a lot of Izzet Control, mucking around. I'm seeing a lot of that now. So I'm going to lump that in here as well. But a lot of them are mostly Stoneblade decks. So Control decks, again, you can grind with them. You're just going to have to keep in mind that a lot of your early creatures are going to die. This is how it is. That's what they do anyway. They're really good at it. So you're going to have to keep that in mind. Don't overcommit to the board, especially if your opponent's playing with white, which they almost always are. If they're playing a Stoneblade deck, you have to keep in mind that they're going to have Supreme Verdict or even Wrath of God. I've seen a few of those coming and going. So you have to be really careful about how much you commit to the board. Don't overcommit unless you have a way of protecting yourself or protecting those creatures, which is a general rule of thumb, I think, when you're playing decks like this, but especially against Control decks. Just play intelligently and anticipate those artifacts. You're going to want to bring in a lot of artifact removal. Natural State will take care of most of the things they're going to be bringing in. You're also going to want to bring in Engineer Explosives to take care of Germ Tokens or any other shenanigans your opponent might be bringing in. But, get ready for the long game. Those games are not going to finish quickly. You're definitely going to grind out. You might want to bring in Cleansing Wildfire to attack their lands. I wouldn't recommend it. I think just stick to playing intelligently, being, resource efficient, and you can get through. But I don't think it's going to be a super easy matchup. But I also don't think they're heavily favored against you. Last but not least, mid-range. Listen, they play this, similar removal packages to you, and they probably can outgrind you a bit better. But what's nice about Counter Shadow is that you have Death Shadow, which a lot of these mid-range decks also have. So in the mid to late game, you are going to be able to keep up with their Death Shadows. You're not going to be as afraid. And they're going to have to also be careful. So this deck really plays like a mid-range deck at some point. Once the tempo plan is out the window, it converts to mid-range pretty well. And black really helps you out play the mid-range game better than white does in Lurrus Counter-Cat. So in Lurrus Counter Shadow, I think actually you could probably do pretty well. You just have to be really comfortable with this deck. I mean, if you are serious about picking up this deck, whether it's Counter Shadow or Counter Cat, play a lot with it, put in a lot of repetition, be really comfortable, like really have a good feel for how the deck draws and plays, and then I think your mid-range matchups will become very favorable in your favor. That's really just been my experience and the way I've seen other people play these types of decks and what their outcomes are compared to mine. You just have to be really comfortable with your deck. You have to be really familiar with the mid-range decks. In this case, it's mostly Jund or Rakdos mid-range. Just, anticipate what they're usually going to be doing. It's usually really easy, very similar play patterns, and I think you can do pretty well against them. So that's it for Lurrus Counter-Shadow. Very similar to Lurrus Counter-Cat. Nothing too revolutionary here, but I just really want to see how I would play the Counter-Cat shell without Wild Nicottle, which is one of the namesakes of the name of the deck. And I put in Death Shadow in its place. I really like Death Shadow. I mean, it's really like a huge roadblock for your opponents once it comes down. They really don't see it coming, and all of a sudden things start changing in your favor. So I really, really enjoyed playing with it. I think I would still go with Lurrus Counter-Cat just as personal taste, but I think that's not a knock against Lurrus Counter-Shadow in terms of power level. And I think there's a lot of room to tweak this list for sure. I think even more than Lurrus Counter-Cat. I think you could do a lot more with this list. Like I said, you could also explore playing discard and maybe cutting down a bit on some of your removal. I think that's totally legitimate, and I would love to hear from you if you decide to play this deck and you decide to go a bit more on the discard package. I'd love to hear from you on how that went and your feedback. I'm genuinely interested. But yeah, let me know in the comment section down below what you think about this deck. There's going to be 3 matches going up later today as usual, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit the notification bell. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, watch my content, share my content on social media. Even just watching my content start to finish really helps me out a lot. I would really appreciate it. Thanks for even listening to this right now. That's helping if you're still here. If you want to support this channel a bit more through Patreon, check out the link in the description of this video. Check out the Patreon rewards. Basically, rewards you get at the end of every year, guaranteed, as a thank you for supporting the channel. So check that out. Thanks, and have a good one.